did cotton farmers get in Tanzania? I'm mentioning this in part because we've talked about Meatu district now twice in Tanzania, in the witch killing paper and in the local public goods paper. And cotton is the main cash crop in Meatu. So 2/3 of the farmers in this district I've worked in Tanzania grow cotton. That's their cash crop. During this period, what share of the world price were they getting? 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%. So the tax is 1 minus that. Okay, so what do we have? So the answer is A. You guys are starting to figure out my tricky clicker style. You're like, he definitely put it there to make it seem like that's just way too low. Okay, I have to come up with a new clicker style. So it's 40%. On average, Tanzanian farmers were getting 40%. So this is just a list from Bates, and I just type just a subset of them in. You can see farmers were getting anywhere from 30%, if you look at groundnuts in Senegal, to 90% of the world market price. But a lot of 40s, 50s, 60s. So that's a pretty high tax rate. It's getting taxed at 40%, 50%. And in Tanzania, in that case, it was 60%. Another important crop that we'll talk about later in class today and the next time is cocoa in Ghana. So cocoa during the colonial period and the early post-independence period was a very lucrative crop. Global prices were very high, and this was seen as just one of the most important cash crops in Africa. And you can see there, right after independence, farmers were getting about 65% of the world price. So not quite as bad as some of the other crops, but still, a decent tax rate. I want to mention a couple of other interesting patterns. If you look at basically in the same years across the same commodities, you see some interesting patterns. That's why I kind of lined these up. Kenya and Tanzania, as you guys have seen on the map before, neighboring countries, of course, they share a huge border that goes from Lake Victoria down to the coast. It turns out in the mid-70s, they had very different policies in terms of taxing coffee. And I'll talk about the distinction within Kenya in a sec. But across Kenya and Tanzania, basically Kenyans were getting twice the price Tanzanians were. So if I'm a coffee grower in central Tanzania, I'm only getting 46% of the world price. A coffee grower in central Kenya, right across the border, may be getting as much as 90% of the world price. So let's think about it. If I were a coffee grower in Tanzania, what would I like to do with my crop? You'd want to smuggle it immediately. You'd want to find ways to bring it across the border and pass it off as Kenyan coffee. You get twice the price for it. Turns out that was extremely widespread. It turned out with so many borders and so many countries pursuing so many different policies, it was extremely common that neighboring countries offered their farmers very different prices for the same crop. So it was a widespread issue in the 70s and 80s in African agriculture that smuggling was incredibly widespread. You can see why that's self-defeating for Tanzania. It introduces something that looks like a Laffer curve sort of effect. The Laffer curve, you guys studied maybe in Econ 1 or whatever. By raising the tax rate more here, they're going to get less revenue because now the incentives to smuggle are just so high. They're going to smuggle things across the border. Even today, Busia, Kenya, which we talked about 3 or 4 times in the course, is right on the border with Uganda. The town of Busia, the city is split. There's Busia, Kenya, Busia, Uganda, with the border in the middle. There's still tons of smuggling across the border because there's some moderate tariff differences and price differences on both sides of the border. So one of my friends from the NGO I worked with, his sister-in-law was a smuggler. That was her job. She would take stuff and drive these little back paths across the border because in addition to the main road, there are all these little bike paths and dirt paths. And one out of every 3 or 4 times, she would get caught. She would give the policeman her goods. He would take them and sell them himself. And then that was the tax. But there was such a high profit that it was still worth doing that. Now, when the difference is this large, it's even more worthwhile. Okay, so this is one thing we'll highlight, and we'll come back to this later. The other thing I want to highlight is this difference within Kenya. Very different prices were paid in Kenya for coffee from different sources. What's the difference between estates and cooperatives? Estates are owned by large landowners, some large white farmers, some large African farmers, Kenyan farmers. They got a really good price for their coffee, 93%. Cooperatives, that's coffee grown by smallholders, small farmers, that kind of group their product together in the cooperative to sell. They didn't get a very good price. So it looks here again, we've been talking about what's progressive and regressive, meaning what's progressive helps the poor, what's regressive sort of helps the rich. Just built into the policy was incredible favoritism for rich farmers. So the rich farmers who were politically connected got a great price for their crop. The poor farmers didn't. Go ahead. You basically had to sell your crop to the marketing board. And the marketing board offered different prices for the coffee paid to the large estate farmers and these guys and the smallholders. No, I think there may have been some justification in terms of quality or some differences, but the main difference was just these were like a small handful of very politically connected large plantation owners, estate owners, and these guys were sort of everyday farmers. That's Bates' explanation. That these guys were politically connected enough in this kind of non-democratic period in Kenya that they could get higher prices for their goods. Now again, the same smuggling incentives apply. If you're one of these guys, you want to cut a deal with one of these guys. Claim your coffee is theirs and sort of split the difference, or claim that you work for the estate. So again, there's all these weird distortions and side deals that need to be reached because of these price differences. But it's kind of striking just to see such different prices being paid in these neighboring countries for the same product. And at first glance, it seems insane until you start thinking about the politics. And that's the whole point of the Bates. So what does Bates say? He has some really great quotes. So I just put a couple of them up there. Why should reasonable people adopt public policies that have harmful consequences for the societies they govern? And his answer is, it benefits the people in power. And that's sort of the second quote. The collective optimism of the nationalist era, really in the 1960s, has given way to a sullen recognition that the sacrifices of the many have benefited the few. Again, these sort of elites who managed to get really good land in Kenya after independence, set up coffee estates, and rig the system to get paid really good prices for their product. Coffee tends to be grown in the highland areas, again, where there's always been a large Kikuyu population. And again, the president during this period was ethnically Kikuyu. So it's not a coincidence how this kind of happened. So there's an ethnic angle to this as well. Okay, who benefited? I just want to go through the economics. Let's just think through incentives and payoffs here. Who benefits from marketing boards? First, marketing boards that squeeze farmers increase central government revenue. If you think that revenue could be used for good things, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe we're squeezing poor farmers but investing in public health. Maybe that's great. So that's one story here. That's one potential benefit. Who else benefits? Law enforcement officials and customs officials. Customs officials are never poor in any country. They are always rich. And the reason they're rich is they're corrupt in every country. And they make lots of money. And there's so much evidence of this that's coming out. So again, I mentioned the case of smuggling across the Kenya-Uganda border. It's great to be a customs official on a border, especially when there's a twofold difference in price. Because when you catch people, you can basically get a cut. You either let the smuggler go through and pay you a bribe, or you take the goods for yourself. Same thing with police officials. Right near the border of Kenya and Uganda, on the main road, there's all these police checkpoints for no real reason. There's not really any crime in these rural areas. Police don't have that much to do. There's a lot of these checkpoints to catch smugglers, or to catch them or to extract bribes from them. Who else benefits? Smugglers benefit. If you have marketing boards with wacky prices, you can make lots of money, for sure. So they really have no incentive to change the law. They can make lots of money off this system. The other kind of obvious group that benefits from marketing board policies like this are the bureaucrats working for the marketing boards. So marketing boards have, and I'll show you some of the numbers, huge numbers of staff, bureaucrats, et cetera, many of whom didn't have that much work to do. But what marketing boards became in many African countries were sources of political patronage. What that means is this was a government job. The marketing board was generating lots of revenue. I could basically get my friends jobs in the government and the marketing board, and they didn't really even need to show up because there wasn't much work to do. This is sounding worse and worse, unless you have one of these jobs. Who else benefits? Urban residents benefit. There was a point before about food prices. If I'm not producing food, I'm just consuming it, I love having really cheap food. So basically, urban residents could benefit a lot from this. They get really cheap food. Their cousins in the countryside, though, aren't getting paid anything for it. The big losers are the farmers, the majority of the population, who are getting paid next to nothing for their crops. And if they try to sell it at the world price, are getting basically squeezed and coerced by the marketing board into not doing so. So the continuity is the African farmer and their product was seen as something to be extracted. Their resources and their profits were extracted before back to Europe, and now to the national capital for whatever the political goals were of the new leaders. But the prices paid to African farmers didn't really improve. So for the majority of African population, if you think of their economic well-being, independence didn't deliver nearly as much as it could have, because they were still getting squeezed by their rulers. And if they tried to resist, they were basically coerced into going along. Jan. That's a great question. And in fact, when people looked at the big boom in African cities in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, many people pointed to these policies as part of the reason why. So if I leave farming, not only am I not getting kind of screwed over by these marketing boards, now I can move to the cities and eat cheap food, because food is subsidized. So people, there's a guy who's a co-author of mine on that Rhodes paper we talked about. He's at George W. University in DC, Remy Jedwab. He has a bunch of papers on African cities. And he looks at the historical growth of African cities, and he calls them consumption cities. So African cities grew in a way that was very different than a lot of Asian cities. A lot of Asian cities were production hubs, manufacturing hubs. There were very few production and manufacturing hubs in Africa in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but cities grew just as fast. And the idea was they were consumption cities. They were places with cheap food, lots of services, et cetera. So there was this big incentive to move to the city to escape these policies. So you can understand a lot of the time pattern of development through this sort of policy. Any other questions? The other thing that sort of goes hand in hand with these policies, and it also forms a sort of continuity with the colonial period, was the fact that African countries were not very democratic during this period. So we talked about that maybe 2 lectures ago. That basically the democratic period of the 1960s collapsed very quickly. So you have in the 70s and 80s very few democracies in Africa, and it's just going to be a lot easier to pursue policies like this if you're not democratic. The majority of people are getting hurt, but if they can't vote, doesn't matter. You can continue pursuing these policies. Maybe not coincidentally, in the 1990s, as African countries democratized, a lot of these policies were undone. And government policy towards agriculture is much friendlier today than it was in the 70s and 80s. So when we think about institutions and the value that democratic institutions may play in avoiding extremely bad economic outcomes, this is another example, or potential example. Yeah. Exactly. So it's really, in some ways, a very short-sighted policy. So exactly as you're saying, people move to the cities, they're not growing stuff. They don't have enough profits to invest in better crops or infrastructure. So stuff falls apart. A lot of the colonial era infrastructure, the colonial powers also exploited African farmers, but they invested in some irrigation and other things. A lot of that stuff fell apart in the 70s and 80s. So you basically have over time this just decline in productivity. I cut a couple slides just for reasons of time, but an example that you could read about, and that maybe I'll bring in next time, is in Sierra Leone, a country we've studied. There's been documentation about how much did the government, agricultural marketing board, and their various forms of taxes collect over time. They had very repressive agricultural policies. They had very repressive policies in terms of taxing minerals and other things. Over time, the revenue the government of Sierra Leone was able to collect fell massively in the 70s and 80s. So by the 80s, they were just collecting, I think it was a third of what they'd been collecting in the 70s. Precisely because if you tax a sector to death, you won't have anything to tax anymore. So it was a very short-sighted policy. And what ends up happening in the 80s is as all this revenue dries up, as all the production sort of goes away, a lot of African countries start facing problems of huge budget deficits. So yeah, initially they were squeezing agriculture and getting all this revenue. Over time, people did other stuff, or they smuggled everything, or they did something else. So it was a self-defeating policy. There's a lot of parallels. There was a lot of parallels to the ideology of economic policy in Latin America during this period in Africa. So this whole idea of, we're going to tax our kind of cash crop sector to subsidize industrialization. Argentina did that. Brazil did that. A lot of South American countries did it. And even today, Argentina is an interesting case because we're in a global commodity boom the last decade or so. And as soon as commodity prices started going up, a lot of other Latin American countries like Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, they benefited a lot. Their agricultural exports have just skyrocketed, especially with demand in Asia. I mean, it's just like we talk about demand in Asia driving growth in Africa. Like lots of wheat fields in South America grow soybeans to send to Asia. I mean, that's been a huge trend in agriculture. In Argentina, you mentioned Argentina, they've been taxing agriculture during this period. They've been banning exports of certain crops. They've been taxing them. So it looks a lot like the old-fashioned policies, but there's still some Latin American countries following that same sort of, you could say, failed policy. Yeah. Again, and not to get into each country, I went into some depth there, but this ideology of, people talk about similar things in the case of Indonesia, for instance, that there have been periods where economic policy looked very similar in some of the emerging Asian, African, and Latin American countries where squeezing agriculture was going to be the way forward. But the consensus view now in development economics after so many failed experiments is it doesn't really work. Plus, it's really regressive. I think that's the consensus. But yeah. I don't know much about indigo in India. I'm not sure. Maybe it was different. I'm not sure. Okay, I want to make just an aside. We've been talking about parallels to other parts of the world. The big contrast is what rich countries were doing. So instead of squeezing agriculture for a very long time, rich countries have been subsidizing agriculture. And it's interesting to think about why. The political economy is really different. So US farmers are heavily subsidized, European farmers are heavily subsidized, Japanese farmers are heavily subsidized. It's been that way forever. And you can just ask yourself what the difference is. In the US case, people always say, well, because of the electoral college and the fact that every state gets 2 senators, even if they're tiny, you have all these small, predominantly rural states with 2 senators, and it kind of distorts policymaking. So there's all these low population farm states in the West and in the Midwest and whatnot. But that doesn't explain why Europe chooses to do it, right? So the Europeans subsidize their farmers even more than we subsidize our farmers. They're even less efficient. So it can't just be the electoral college. There's something more fundamental. But rural populations in many rich countries are heavily subsidized. And that's a stark difference, where traditionally in poor countries, the poorest residents in rural areas, the majority population, was taxed, but the small minority in rich countries of farmers were subsidized. Now, what people have said in the US is, you're thinking about it all wrong if you think of these small numbers of farmers in rural areas. The real beneficiaries of all these subsidies and tax credits are corporations that are involved in agribusiness or sort of more organized, large-scale agriculture. But that's another debate, but it's worth keeping in mind that the politics of agricultural policy just look radically different in different parts of the world. Okay, so why did African leaders do this? One issue that we haven't talked about yet, but that is central to the discussion, is the fact that urban politics were seen as much more important than rural politics among newly independent leaders. Why is that? Newly independent leaders were much more concerned and afraid of the well-being of urban residents. Urban residents in the capital were near the presidential palace. Urban residents in the capital were literate and wrote newspapers and had protests. And they were members of labor unions that could organize. There was much more dense political organization, media, and money, middle-class people in cities than in rural areas. So if you're comparing the threat posed by a low-income resident in a rural area or an urban area, the urban resident is much more important. There's a lot of people around. It's dense. They can organize. They can write newspaper articles criticizing the government, get their voice heard. The international community will know if there's a protest in the capital. Something that goes on in a rural area, no one's going to hear about it. No one's going to know about it. It's irrelevant. Plus, it's a lot harder to organize in a sparsely populated rural area anyway. If I have a protest march, just me and my 3 friends down the road, who's going to know? It won't even matter. So the idea was there was a focus on urban politics. So just imagine, just to put things in kind of some sort of functional form, imagine what I care about as a leader. I care about lots of things. But let's say one of the things I care about is staying in power. It's the 70s and 80s. I'm a dictator. I want to stay in power. And my probability of retaining power is some function of average incomes in urban areas and average incomes in rural areas. And the feeling is the importance in this function, the importance for my retaining power of urban incomes was just much greater than rural incomes. In fact, maybe the influence of rural incomes on my retaining power was pretty close to zero over some period. I could tax these guys at 60 or 70%, give them no services, nothing's going to happen for a while. But urban residents, I need cheap food for them. I don't want them to have a protest. I have to make sure that urban workers and students and intellectuals and middle class sort of live well. So I'm going to subsidize them. Let me pause for a second. Any questions? Yeah. I see. Okay, so that's an interesting question. So you're saying, if I'm a repressive autocracy and I have the military under control, the police under control, et cetera, why not just steal everything and not give any subsidies to anybody? Why am I giving anything even to the urban residents? So I think there's some element of that, and there's enough cases of leaders enriching themselves massively to the detriment of their population that clearly they had some leeway to do that. But if there was any group they feared, if they did fear losing control, if there was any group they feared, it would have been urban residents over rural residents. So there's something to what you're saying, but there was still more possibility that well-organized urban opposition would unseat them relative to rural movements. Evan. Yeah. Yeah, so in Tanzania, from the late 60s into the kind of mid-70s was a period of nationalizations. A lot of formerly privately owned industry was nationalized. Co-ops that had been private farmer co-ops were nationalized and became state-organized co-ops. So there was this nationalization and centralization during that period, for sure. And the idea was all these revenue would go into subsidized cement factories, steel factories, glass factories, et cetera, consumer good factories. The consensus, we're going to come back to it probably on Thursday. The consensus was that a lot of that investment was not extremely successful. That a lot of the state-led industrialization did not really pan out. And, the question was raised before about the Latin American case. There's a similar consensus about a lot of the state-led industrialization in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. There were some successes, but there were a lot of failures to it too. It's a little hard to judge. So, a lot of the industrial projects in Africa are just coming online in the 70s into the 80s. And, there was a major global recession in 1982. There was the debt crisis. So, it could be the case that if the broader macro environment were better, maybe some of these state-led industrial projects would have done better. We can't rule that out. But they weren't some sort of amazing success. That's kind of the consensus. So there's a feeling that a lot of money was wasted, basically, on projects that didn't pan out, and farmers lost out anyway. Any other questions? Okay, so let's just go through. I've been alluding to this crisis that came in. So what ends up happening? So once we get into the late 70s, and especially the early 80s, there's a feeling of crisis that emerges in economic crisis in Africa. And part of the reason why Bates' book was so influential, this was an incredibly influential book, not just intellectually, but in terms of policy, is it shows up in 1981, and the global recession and the African and Latin American debt crisis breaks out in 1982. So people were kind of like looking for answers, like what went wrong, and he had a story for what went wrong. So what ends up happening? Because of these incredibly high rates of taxation on agriculture, you see falling production, either actual production or just because of smuggling, so recorded production falls, you see falling revenues. That just comes out directly from the economic logic we've been talking about. You can't tax a sector at 70% and still think you're going to raise revenue for a long time. Chronic budget deficits emerge. To meet them, African countries start borrowing more and more money in the late 70s and early 80s. So revenues fall, deficits increase, foreign debt is increasing as countries try to meet the deficits year to year. What they couldn't borrow, they ended up paying for by printing money. So when debts couldn't be met, money was printed to pay off locally denominated debt, leading to high rates of inflation. So there's this terrible spiral that sort of sets in. There's a very similar chain of events in Latin America during this period. Budget deficits, borrowing, high rates of inflation. At the same time, these sort of monopoly agricultural marketing boards were bloated with tons of spare employees that weren't productive. A lot had been channeled into state industries that didn't seem very efficient. Again,